Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 31. My guest in this episode is Mindy Mandell. Mindy is an author as well as a practicing Platonist, and we will discover what that means in the interview and what Platonism has done for Mindy and what it can potentially do for anyone who is curious and wants to perhaps couple another belief system or wisdom teaching to their current practice. I highly recommend that you investigate the work that Mindy has done. I will have links to her book, Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom, as well as her YouTube channel, all about Platonism, and that will all be in the description field. But in the meantime, enjoy this conversation. I very much enjoyed conversing with Mindy. It was a very wonderful and informative conversation, so I invite you to join us for that, and thank you. And I'd like to welcome Mindy Mandell to the IdeaCast interview series. And upon discovering her work, both on YouTube and her writing, I was just convinced I had to have her on this show and have her enlighten not only myself, but the viewers. And so, Mindy, it's an honor to have you on the IdeaCast interview series. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I would like to just do a traditional kickoff to this and ask you some background information about how you came to philosophy and how you came to being an inquiring person who wanted to know more about the grounding nature of reality. So can you give us a little backstory?
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in philosophy, but like as a high school student and even as a university student, I never really got into it. I never felt it had meaning. And I think I was an unhappy kid and I was always looking for meaning and trying to make sense of things. And it seems like the world just doesn't make any sense. And it felt very empty to just every day get up and go to school. And the idea of getting a career also just seemed empty and nothing really appealed to me. But in my late 20s, I did meet someone, a coworker, who read Plato much the way I do now, who saw meaning in it. He'd had some very powerful spiritual experiences, and Plato helped him understand them. And he introduced me to Plato in a way that I was never introduced to it in university. And it suddenly made sense to me. And suddenly it opened up this whole world of meaning. My friend told me this one story that really resonated with me. He said that he was a philosophy major in his university.
Okay.
And he would debate sometimes the professors because they're not spiritual and he had a very different view.
Uh-huh.
And he said one day he was arguing with the professor and the professor just stopped at one point and just looked shocked and said, "You actually believe this, don't you?"
Oh.
It was an epiphany for my friend as well, because it never occurred to him that anybody would spend their life studying a philosophy, teaching a philosophy that they don't actually believe. What is the point? and that really resonated with me because it wasn't until Plato had meaning to me that I actually felt alive by reading it. And I started to, see an order to the world and just see myself as a part of a bigger whole, that this physical world is not all that's real. And when you start to see that order, then you start to understand why most people don't see it. And of course, I didn't see it before until it's pointed out. And then you can start to understand all the madness and craziness going on around us. So I think it's really important to understand what is this world that we're a part of? What is this whole that we're a part of? And that's what reading Plato does for me. That's how I got into it. So.
Wonderful. Yeah, wonderful. And your work with Plato, I have to admit, coming to your work, I was sort of in the position of the professor, more seeing Plato in a very two-dimensional, very sterile manner, because that's what's presented. That's what's granted to us for the most part in academia. And I'm not by any means an academic, I'm self-taught, but that's what's on offer. And so opening up this other dimension and putting it on another axis really does give it another what's the word? This paradigm, it's just this other meaning and value that comes out of it. And so can you speak to, so we're essentially understanding the nature of reality through Platonic teaching. And so where do we begin with that? Where do we even start with that inquiry? And we'll cast aside all other sort of traditional, like Abrahamic belief systems and so forth like that, and just start out like a blank tabula rasa here. And just so we're curious about the nature of reality. And so what does Plato offer us as, again, a more dynamic or a richer, more spiritually informed approach to Platonism?
Yeah, initially, I think we're brought into it by just questioning things. I think the first dialogue I read was the Apology, or sometimes the title is translated as Socrates' defense. It's his court defense. And there he's talking about how he used to question people. And one of his friends had asked the Delphic Oracle, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the Oracle said no. And he doubted that, but he couldn't just dismiss the Oracle. So he went around questioning people. And what he found was that most people think they know things, but they don't. And so that led him to a lot of questioning. And so the idea that we have to question our own assumptions is really a key part. And so a lot of the early dialogues are about that, looking at like what is virtue? Do we know what it is? We all think we're virtuous, and yet we don't even know what it is. And so questioning ourselves and recognizing that in the sensory world, we're not going to find knowledge. We have to look beyond it. And actually, Proclus, one of the later Platonists, he wrote a beautiful book called The Elements of Theology, which is like to break down metaphysics in very rigorous logical points. And the thing that he starts with is the first proposition that he offers is that everything must have unity. And so unity must be a condition for existence. Our bodies cannot exist without unity. When we pass away, the body decomposes, it no longer exists as a body, right? So everything that exists must have unity, which means that it's a condition for existence. And the conditions must be outside of the effect. The cause is outside of the effect. And so right from the beginning, you're into metaphysics. You're beyond the physical world. For the physical world to exist, everything that exists has a cause. The cause must be outside. Therefore, there must be something outside. And so you're immediately brought out of materialism. And when you see that, then you start to question things in a different way.
And how did they handle? So I'm coming at it from a school of an interest in idealism, where in a more modern sense, idealism treats materiality as another aspect of consciousness or mind, and that's also woven into Advaita Vedanta and things like that. So was there a handling of what the material world is in his treatment?
Yeah. Basically, he sees the world of what is called in academia forms or ideas,
Okay.
as you might say a paradigm for our world. That our world is kind of like a image or copy, but not in the sense of being fake. It's that there's like a progression of reality, overflowing, if you will, flowing down. And as it spreads into differentiation and lesser power, it's still very much real. Like our realm, the Platonists would say that our realm does have a reality to it. I mean, I'm here talking to you. This is real, and yet it's not ultimate reality.
Okay. But not, go ahead.
So I'm going to say one of the differences between academic Platonists and spiritual Platonists is what we think the ideas are. We're all realists in the sense that we think that this realm is more real than the physical world. But I think academics limit their understanding of the world of ideas, or the intelligible world, to pure thought, whatever that is. Like I took actually a philosophy 101 class when I was a university student, and we learned the forms as something like these like blueprints in the sky or something. I don't know what they were. It didn't make any sense. How can it be pure thought? Because thought is in the human mind, but these thoughts are prior, metaphysically prior to human beings.
Hmm.
But what are they? And they don't want to call it spiritual, but we do. And
Hmm.
that,
So using, working with Platonism, can you give a definition of spiritual? I believe you did that in your book. And so I'd like to have you walk through spiritual and also mysticism, if it's not too soon to bring that up, just so we get some ground definitions going.
yeah, I think spiritual is recognizing anything outside of the physical.
Okay.
And I think mystics, a lot of people call themselves spiritual, but they still see themselves as mainly a physical being who has a spiritual aspect. But when you get into mysticism, you're starting to recognize that that spiritual side is our essence, and we merely take on physical form in each lifetime. And
Okay.
so more of like, I treat mysticism as maybe maybe on the spectrum of spirituality, it's on a more extreme end. Like there are people who see themselves as spiritual, but they see themselves as physical. And the spiritual is something they'll dabble in a little bit. Mystics stay very much in that spiritual realm and treat the physical as something we dabble in.
Okay. So maybe I'll try to illustrate as a question. So there's a supervening kind of, if they call it the forms, it's coming down. And so to be more of a mystic is to, and I believe you referenced it's looking up, it's sort of acknowledging the process, the flow, if you will, of, I forget how you wrote the hierarchy up. It's you can do this for me, but it's the intelligible realms, and they sort of go down. And so that's kind of what is being said when you're talking about mysticism. It is being more present with that process, that iterative process, right? Am I close?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And that makes sense too, right? Because so I get very monistic in the sense that I don't really discern much of a difference between mind, spirit, and the physicality of being, so it's all sort of representation. But we have to acknowledge, I am a realist and I'm a naturalist, I certainly acknowledge the world out there, but I also like to play around in the realm of imagination, that it's all the same thing. It's just perspectival or aspectual, and not so far as like the Maya or the illusion. I don't go that far. I just like to think that it's this sort of relational dance that's going on. So I don't know if I'm straying out of Platonism when I speak that way, but it sort of resonated with me when you were talking about, and the terms are running out of my head now, but again, that supervening process. Yeah. So Parmenides was a big influence on Plato as well, and he's someone that I've studied as someone who, again, likes to dabble around in thoughts of idealism and sort of a monist almost, or I guess it's a unity, right? Maybe to use the terms, there is no separation. Is that straying too far? And what by that I mean, sort of, all is one kind of thing, but not in sort of aphorism, hippie kind of context. It's more that mind just is expressing itself, or the good, if that's a good term, is expressing itself in these realms or iterative states, or however.
And all returns.
Okay. And that, again, I think you were saying that Parmenides was a big influence on Plato in that regard, right?
Yeah, that he used number as a sort of a doorway into the spiritual. That like we tend in our modern thinking to think of mathematical formulas or scientific formulas as something that humans just created. But what he recognized is that we are discovering something that is true. And when we make adjustments to our formulas or to our understanding, it's really just our understanding that we're fine-tuning. But we're not inventing these formulas. We're discovering them because there's something about them that is always true. true before humans came here, really true after, and it doesn't matter like the cultures at the time that people are living. These formulas, they're pointing to something that is real.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was in that way that that Parmenides was a big, oh, I'm sorry, Pythagoras, right?
Well, Parmenides, but yeah, let's bring
Okay,
Pythagoras in because
sorry, I was thinking Pythagoras.
oh, no, that's okay. Well,
He's
it's
also,
good.
yes, he was a monist. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry. And there's actually a dialogue of Plato's called Parmenides, where he's showing that the one, or like called the one self, or the one itself, however you translate it, is the only thing that is truly real, and yet it's as the cause of all. We technically can't say it exists because it's the cause of existence, it's prior to it. Yet being the cause, we can't say it's nothing. And then you can see the unfolding of reality from that, coming out of that, but it all goes back at the end to that's the only thing. We have to be, ultimately, Parmenides says all of the unfolding that it ultimately is not what is real. We have to look to the one self.
Our language is very limited in that regard, right? We have to stay confined to spatiotemporal terms and metaphor and imagery and signifier and signified, but
so those are the assumptions we have to keep questioning, and that's what makes it a real challenge, because we're trying to look at what is the cause or the conditions of our physical world of time and space.
mm-hmm.
And we bring these assumptions about time and space with us, and even though we try to drop them, we're bringing some assumptions in that we didn't realize we're bringing in. And so that's the real challenge, is to allow ourselves to even imagine what is beyond time and space.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing for my own life and my practice is I think I even joked with you on emails is that I sort of tongue in cheek refer to myself as a neo-Pyrrhonian, like a Pyrrhonian, inspired by Pyrrhonians or sexist empiricus and Pyrrhonian skepticism. And I say skepticism handle it very gently because we always think of cynicism when we think of skepticism and denying everything. And, this is all nonsense and, empiricism and all this. But no, I think skepticism is essential as an element of inquiry so that you can be guarded and cautious and like you said, know our limitations and then know how to proceed with or around things. And so I use it very sparingly. It's a tool in my toolbox, but I use it lightly and sparingly. But it helps me. It gives me greater insight. Plus, I don't presuppose as much, or I don't become too dogmatic into things.
Yeah. And I think I found for myself that over the years, as I've gotten deeper into this way of thinking and challenged more of my assumptions about the physical world being my limitation, my sense of what is the scope of human experience, what is possible, it has now finally started to spread beyond the physical senses. And we start to question, well, what is the scope of human experience and ability?
Mm-hmm.
You get more, like I used to think, like in my family is very pragmatic and not spiritual at all. And so the idea of psychic ability or having any kind of spiritual experience is something that is frowned upon, kind of laughed at and teased, and new age, anything like that is just new age and it's just dismissed.
Yeah.
It's just pulled together and dismissed. But so it's been a real challenge for me in those early years to question that and to allow myself to have experiences outside that, to acknowledge experiences outside that I was having.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that my understanding of what it means to be human is much broader and freer in a sense, a sense of freedom.
Yeah.
We're not limited to just our social roles.
Yeah, for sure. And for someone who is a little more dogged about, being rational over being imaginative, if you will, is I would say that we have to acknowledge that there is a will to spirit. There is a will to that mystery. I think in the human psyche, it's imprinted on us. It's either mimetic or it's something brought down through each generation, or it's part of our adaptation strategy, like for the last 15, 20,000 years, as long as we can communicate with each other, we're telling stories about, things and sense making and understanding our reality. And I think that's just such a part of who we are, that even if you're a dogged neo-atheist type, you can't deny that, and you can dismiss it, that's fine, but you can't deny it, right? It's part of who we are, and you can call it irrational and superstitious, but I think that's doing it a terrible disservice to do that, because there are billions of people for whom it is very meaningful and very sensible. And so I think if you can grant it that space and see the results. So I love to study Islamic mystics and Christian mystics from the 13th century. And they report things that, seem pretty out there and pretty wild, but really they find a very strong sense of peace afterwards. So forget about what the process is or what happened. It's that result that they get. And I think that if you talk to the hard-nosed person that say, if someone finds peace in their life and their meaning making is enhanced by whatever it is, it doesn't, let them go. Now we could flip the coin and say, if you're, a fundamentalist and you're using that kind of rhetoric to do bad things, then I'm with you. I'm with the people who want to, question that. But I think they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater when they get too rigid and too skeptical to not accept that this is part of who we are.
But if you come from a logical background, it's really hard to get into that kind of mysticism that doesn't explain anything, that doesn't explore the reasons for it.
Mm-hmm.
I was always kind of curious about Buddhism or Hinduism, but I couldn't really get into them until I started studying Plato, because it brought intelligibility to what Buddhists and Hindus were writing about. And it's really nice for me to meet someone like you who also is spiritual, but who questions it in a logical way. I think Platonists, we kind of don't really fit in anywhere.
Right.
We are too logical and too philosophical for other mystics and too mystical for other philosophers.
Yeah, you're in a gray zone.
Really appreciates us, but we're actually the bridge that brings the two together.
Yeah.
Because once you get into Plato and you start to understand the metaphysics that he's describing, then you can go to those mystics, the Buddhists, the Hindus, and the other mystics, and you can start to bring that intelligibility to what you're reading and say, that's what's going on here. Now I see it. The methodology is very different, but the metaphysics has quite a bit in common. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. And even those mystics that I referenced, if you dig a little bit, like people like Ibn Arabi and even Marguerite Porete, who are two of my favorites, both were informed, and I know you don't like the term, but by Neoplatonism, or sort of the lineage of Platonism. And so it's in there, it's baked into that. And it's speculative. There are people who study Sufism who say, no, Ibn Arabi wasn't influenced, but I think there was some of that, because it was such there was a Creole being created there in the Middle East and in Southern Europe and off into Asia, that they were exchanging ideas and thoughts. And and the monastery that took in Marguerite Porete was Celtic, and they were highly influenced by Western or Greek philosophy and things like that. And I'm really not doing a good service to it by saying it directly like that, but they brought that into their camp. The people that brought in Marguerite. So anyway, so you brought in I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I've heard that, Plotinus was a big influence on Sufism and some other systems as well. Yeah.
Right. It was a much more civilized age. I think everybody played well together, and I think the boundaries were looser, right? A lot of things were coming in from India. Like when I joked about Pyrrhonian skepticism, that was brought in Greek philosophy that was influenced by Ajnana skepticism in India, which was a rival to the early forms of Advaita Vedanta and maybe Shankara and things like that. So yeah, there was a nice play going on there. And that's why that's a sweet spot, that 12th, 13th, 14th century. I think a lot of good ideas were being had, and people were, people were synthesizing things. And I think that's an inspiration in of itself. Now, I was going to say a moment ago, you were brought in Pythagoras. Can we talk about Plato's handling of geometry? Let's go maybe to mathematics for a moment. Is there things you want to bring out for that?
Yeah, I think that the key to understanding the way mathematics are used in Plato is to recognize that he's not really interested in the calculations necessarily, but it's recognizing numbers as is that doorway into the divine.
Okay.
And recognizing also analogy as a mathematical representation of the logos
Okay.
that runs through all. And you can see in the harmony and the order that he shows through analogy that it runs through the whole unfolding of reality and in every aspect of what is real. And so that's how he uses math. And to see that insight, even if you're not a person who ever really liked math in school, I wasn't.
Yeah, same here.
But I can appreciate the way math is used in the Platonic system. And so seeing what it's pointing to is what is key to understanding how he uses it.
Okay. And I'll keep referencing your book. He actually uses almost literal geometric forms to describe the monads within triads, and again that supervening process.
To be clear, that the triads is Proclus.
Proclus. Oh, I'm sorry, but that.
Yeah, but it comes out of Plato as well.
Okay, so it was a second another generation of working with Platonic thought. Okay, so Proclus was that. Okay, see, I'm learning, getting my chops here. Can we talk about the four virtues? Would you like to unpack those and talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, I think that they're greatly misunderstood, the way they're taught in universities, especially temperance, I think is greatly misunderstood as being this like, this idea that you should like deny your emotions. That's the way it's often taught, but that's not at all what I see in the emotion in the virtues.
Mm-hmm.
I see them as, in a sense, they're the means of practice, but they're also the goal. The fullest flowering of them is the goal. Wisdom is the one that is at the root. And wisdom we can basically define as looking to what is most real. And maybe initially we have just opinion about it, and we start to gain some understanding. Eventually we can have some experiences of reality and understanding of experience. We can deepen our wisdom. This is human wisdom. Ultimately, he says wisdom is with the gods only. But we're talking about human wisdom as one of the virtues. This is what wisdom is staying focused on what is real,
Mm-hmm.
and maintaining that. And then courage then would be that conviction that keeps us focused on wisdom and not getting distracted by fears or pleasures, but staying focused and having that courage then to stay focused. And so then temperance is understood. It's sophrosyn in Greek, and it's translated a few different ways. Sound-mindedness or moderation is another possible translation I've seen. But it's like this harmony between within the soul that when in the fullest flowering of temperance, we just naturally desire what is healthy for the soul because we understand that that is what is truly good for us. When we find it early on in our practice, when we're drawn this way and that way, we find that we think this is good, but it's actually hurting us, right? We find ourselves drawn in different directions, drawn into the physical world more, seeking those pleasures and whatnot. But when we find that we are what we truly are in essence is soul, as we gain more wisdom and understanding what it means to be human, what we are in essence, we're just naturally going to desire to stay focused on that, and we're less tempted by what is around us.
Mm.
And then justice, the way it's described by Plato, is when all the aspects of the soul are functioning in their proper way. And it's a state of mind, actually all of them, to understand virtue and how they all function together is to understand them as a state of mind. So you're bringing a healthy condition to your soul, and it manifests in this healthy state of mind that we call virtue. So I think early on, we may find ourselves telling ourselves, oh, this is bad for me, even though I desire it. And so that's why we have to resist. And that's why we think of temperance as that denial.
Okay.
but it's actually not the aim of it. Yeah.
Okay. It's not about the denial per se. It is sort of the process you move through. So temperance is more of a, oh, I don't want to screw this up. It's more of a being state, right? It's just you are in the state of temperance, so that maybe the salience of desire maybe narrows down a little bit. So in other words, you're not necessarily as easily distracted. Is that what's going on? As opposed to like, I, have this iron will and I'm going to stand tall before the chocolate fudge sundae or the beautiful people,
It's okay to eat the chocolate fudge sundae.
Once in a while, it's fun. Yeah. Little hedonism is okay. Yeah. We need breaks.
To be temperate. Yeah.
All this virtuous living. Oh gosh. And then there was fortitude, right? Is that
fortitude is another word for courage.
Okay.
So that's that conviction that staying focused on the nature of reality is what is best for us. And so we're not going to let ourselves get tempted. So that's actually where you may find yourself resisting some temptations sometimes. It is early on with courage. Or in my practice now, I've been doing this for like 20 years now, and I see a lot of changes in me, and I'm very much committed to this life. And yet I find that in some of my meditations, there are still fears that come up, fears of the unknown and whatnot. And courage is saying, I'm going to stay focused and not let myself give in to this fear. So that's
and that's almost kind of like when Buddhism teaches you to respect impermanence. You just learn that there are no guarantees, and so that requires courage, right, to stand in the face of that. There's an instructor I like that's on YouTube, and unfortunately part of his house burned down and all of his works, he has a PhD in Buddhist studies, and everything burned down. And like within a day or two of that, he's like, this is a great lesson in impermanence. I lost a lot, all of my books, all these tangible things. And I thought, wow, that is really resilient to stand just outside of where the fire was and be an example. And so so courage and fortitude, certainly part of the package, I would say, and in a moving forward in a spiritual journey, or a journey of self-discovery, which I would say are synonymous.
And we find that the I would say intellectual insights, but maybe conceptual insights, theoretical insights come first. We see it, but we don't necessarily feel it right away. And so that's where there may be some courage as well, to overcome our false beliefs and our connection to the physical world, that even though some elements of it are unhealthy and we need to let them go in order to keep advancing, but we see it, but we don't yet feel it. And so that's also a place where courage is required.
Okay. And also, I think in your book, you mentioned that when growth occurs, that we have to kind of get out of those skins and move to the next layer of skin that we're going to expose and show to the world. And I'm using metaphors here, but that speaks to that practice that you do. And because you reference some anecdotes of your own, you just get to this place. And I think we all do that when we're in these modes of inquiry for the self and for deepening our understanding of our interaction with reality, is that we have to kind of stand in that fire sometimes and not feel comfortable with the change.
A lot of uncomfortable moments. When something opens up, there is a freedom feel. Overall, when I look back, I definitely feel much freer, and I'm much healthier, and I dropped a lot of insecurities I used to have and a lot of my doubts, and I no longer wake up in the morning thinking life is meaningless and pointless. So there is definitely that positive aspect, but I can't say that every single day has been happy. There's a lot of darkness, because you got to look at that darkness in yourself and you got to let it go. And even letting go of like old patterns that were miserable is still a letting go, and it feels like a loss sometimes.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So there's a lot of courage that's required to stay in this life.
To move forward. Yeah. And when you talk about letting go of even the shadowy things, or confronting the shadow and then trying to, move beyond it, or at least manage the shadow, that you know, there's psychological addiction, I think. That's a strong word, but there's attachment to the feelings that are attached to a shadowy aspect of ourselves. So like we could stay in a cyclical state of resentment or a cyclical state of trauma or harm, and it's all very real. I'm not certainly not trying to belittle any of that, but that takes that same chutzpah to get moving and move through that. I'm sorry, I hit my microphone, but to move through that. So that needs to be recognized, that if you're feeling really uncomfortable and you're feeling scared, you know, of what's, you know, you're having an existential crisis, well, you know, that's I think par for the course, right? That you're growing out of something, or you're letting go of something.
You know, there's a curious phenomenon that our daydreams have at their root a self-image.
Mm.
And once we drop that self-image, we can't really go into that daydream anymore.
Mm.
And I've had experiences where I found myself, like, I'm used to falling into certain daydreams or certain thought patterns. And once I see through that self-image, I can't fall into those daydreams anymore. And then I have the thought, what am I supposed to think about instead? And it's a stupid thought, you know, it only lasts for a minute. And I realize, okay, there are a lot of things I could be thinking about that are more meaningful. But there is that feeling of a loss, like, what am I supposed to do now? I don't know how to be this healthier version of myself. I'm so used to seeing myself as this insecure person or as this person who feels small. I don't know how to be healthier. And so we have to actually learn to grow into those healthier stages as we're going, you know, step by step along the way.
Yeah, and that brings to mind a couple of times in your book you pointed out that, you know, we have to confront childhood, everything, childhood. You know, I always like to say that there's a cost benefit to growing up, you know, and the experience of developing as a child who's not emotionally complex, cannot process things. We carry that forward. So there's the psychology, but there's also the introjection, what we learn from our elders, our parents, teachers, et cetera. And so a lot of that has to be confronted too in the Platonic model of growth, or what you work with as growth, that has to be acknowledged and perhaps addressed as best as possible, and understood that it is very complex and it is entrenched, right?
The basic principle is this, that whenever we're seeking a personally meaningful goal, we're going to be confronted by any self-image that limits us from that goal. So we're going to have to challenge really all of our childhood beliefs when we're doing philosophy. I mean, if you want like to get a certain job, you want to be the boss, then you may have to confront certain insecurities or doubts that you have in yourself, and you are going to be confronted with the same basic principle, you know, functions even in like the conventional or mundane circles of life. But when your goal is to know the self itself, like know thyself in that highest sense, then you're going to have to confront really every self-image that you have. And so along the way, you're going to find that you really want to be focused on metaphysics. And I think this is normal, that people don't really want to deal with the mundane stuff. It seems beneath us as philosophers. We want to focus on like the more, on the loftier metaphysical studies. But if we don't deal with that mundane stuff, we're going to find it really, really hard to stay in those deeper philosophical studies. So we do have to confront really everything we learned in childhood.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that goes across all modalities too, whether you're a New Ager or you're a Christian. You know, some people can put on a veneer of achievement or growth and development, but it's not going to feel comfortable, or it's not going to feel right. And I'm guilty of that. I mean, I did that when I was younger, and I probably still do, and I'm not maybe conscious of it. Although again, pretending to be a skeptic or whatever, I'm just like, I don't know. What do I know? Yeah. So that's perhaps my coping mechanism is I don't know anything. And I feel really good about it because it's freeing in a sense, but you know, that could be its own kind of bypassing. But anyway, but yeah, it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. But yeah, Platonism seems to offer a template means of recognizing and working with whatever it is that needs to be dealt with. It's a good wisdom tradition. Now, you spoke to the mythology and the use of gods, and were they enneads? Is that the right term? The sort of liaison. Okay.
Ennead is a transliteration of a Greek word that means oneness.
Okay. But there is this sort of liaison kind of capacity going on there, right? Sort of help us inform. Do you think in our modern society, I mean, we can certainly look back to the old myths and the old mythologies as didactic, and I don't mean that, and sometimes didactic becomes pejorative, and I mean this in the highest sense of didactic, like a teaching mechanism, a tool for wisdom. Do we have modern myth making that fits to the good and virtuous, high learning in this sense, or do we have to go back to the old classics? That's a really probably an abstract question that may not have a good answer to it. But so maybe I'm saying, is it best to start with those old myths and then maybe recognize what's going on in our modern cultural?
Was the closest we come to that, or maybe Hollywood movies sometimes try
Right.
to create that with like superheroes and whatnot.
The hero journey and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. But Plato was keen on that, right? I mean, he was immersed in it. I mean, that was the culture for him, right? Was to use use these gods and these characters as teaching aids for people who were essentially illiterate, and it was a very visual oriented system. And I think Judaism did that too. And there were, and I think that's one of the problems we're running into with modern spirituality and religion, is that we're taking allegory literally, and there's a whole discipline there, right? I mean, you've got to really kind of tread carefully when you're understanding these things, right?
Right, but for the Platonists, the gods were not meant to be taken literally.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There are, we say, personifications of divine forces. And so each time a different force or power is being discussed, a different god is named. And so the key to reading Greek mythology is to see how the gods interact with one another, how they work together.
Okay.
Like gods of course, siblings are functioning at the same power level. Or when you see like Zeus and Kronos, father and son, then you're looking at like a cause and the next progression of intellect in that case. So like you want to see like the relationships of how they interact with one another.
Okay. So I think that's highly valuable if you're going to, and I'm speaking to the viewers, that if you're going to, and Mindy's work is perfect for this, engage with understanding that, you look into those stories, the myths, and understand what their meaning is. And I'm overstating something that's, part and parcel of the learning, but I think it's worth mentioning that, having that grasp.
I do have some videos on my YouTube channel about the gods.
Okay.
And for the viewers, any of you are interested, I do have a YouTube channel called All About Platonism. And for the first year and a half or so, I went through all of Plato's dialogues. So there are videos on all the dialogues. And I have them all, broken up into like early, middle, and late. And then for the last few months, what I've been doing is covering different topics. Some of them are like metaphysical topics. So there are some on mythology. Also some of the more practical side, like how to deal with false beliefs as they come up, or those blocks that come up that stop that, those self-images that limit us, how to deal with those, or how to read in a way that will really allow for a transformation. So very different, because our goal is quite different, from a university class. Their idea of knowledge is putting information into you. And so professors want to tell you everything that they know to show that they're knowers. Whereas in a wisdom tradition like this, the idea is to pull out the wisdom that's in our own soul. And so we don't want to tell everything. We want to raise questions, and we want people to become curious and start questioning things and looking at things differently and saying, oh, you know what, I thought I understood this, but I don't. And let me think about it some more. And so all of these sorts of topics are covered on the website, and there is something about the gods as well.
Oh yeah, and I can't recommend your YouTube channel enough to people, to viewers, please. Yeah, and I'll have all the information and links below for Mindy's work and how to access that. But yeah, I highly recommend it. And oh, and I was going to say something clever and interesting a second ago, but it just zipped right out of my head. Anyway, it's okay. You're saying lots of clever and interesting things, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about unity in one of your latest uploads, and I love that. That was really a nice module to work with. So you have a book out. Can we talk about the book too? And I want to make sure that, and I'll introduce it in the beginning of the video. There we go.
Covering the Beauty of Wisdom. And it's put out by the British publisher Prometheus Trust.
There you go. That's beautiful. Now, I know we're getting close to the hour mark. Would we be able to talk about the allegory of the cave as seen through the less sterile academic sense? And do we have time to maybe talk about that, or do you want to save that for another conversation? Because I think that's kind of a neat one too. Or we can do a part 2 and start with the allegory of the cave, because there's a lot to talk about there. But
yeah, there is quite a bit there. I can't give you a detailed discussion of it right now, but I can give a quick overview. That I think it's generally recognized in academia that being chained, the story basically is that we're like chained prisoners in a cave, and we don't realize all that's going on behind us. We only see these shadows on a wall. There's something going on behind us, and there's a fire casting the shadows of the activity behind us onto a wall. And we see that, and we mistake the shadows for all that is. And so that's like our physical, like our material world, I should say, our material world. And we think that's all that is real. But then we imagine somebody being freed from their chains, and they get up and they recognize all that's happening inside the cave. And then they eventually go up this long, steep ascent to see the upper world. And I think academia tends to focus on the cave, saying that, we just that we have a lot of ignorance in our physical world, but they still kind of stay in the physical world. So they stay in that ignorance, and they don't realize that the upper world is really the main part of the story, because that's the intelligible world, what is true, what is real. And it's about that person going through that philosophical exploration to explore all that is up there. First looking at only at nighttime or at shadows within the upper world, and eventually looking to the sun itself in its own place. So that's like that highest experience of beauty itself, as it's described in the symposium.
okay, wonderful. And so that was a good tie-in for, we were just talking about mythology and using, again, in the best of possible meaning, the didactic, and also talking about how a more comprehensive view can be had of Plato's teachings. And so you handle this very well in your book. So for folks watching, the allegory of the cave, as Mindy explains it in the book, is very satisfying. So I would suggest that.
I'd also want to point out that in the cave allegory, after seeing the upper world, this person goes back down into the cave.
Mm-hmm.
Platonism is not a system where you want to where the goal is to just have some sort of experience and then live in la la land.
Yeah.
Come back to the physical world. The physical world does have a role, and it does matter. We don't deny the physical. That's another misunderstanding, I think, of Platonism, is that we deny the body and we think it's evil and we don't want anything to do with the physical. And that is absolutely not in Plato.
That's good. That's very pragmatic. And the other thing that I admire and appreciate about, as I understand through your work, what Plato was trying to convey is preserving the intellect and the mind, and making that without it, so it's a balance. It's this homeostasis. And so what I would call the soul is what I would call the psyche. And so that there is this, and there's the logos, and there's this relationship. So again, as somebody who flirts with idealism, that resonates with me, because I do like the concept that there is an ontological grounding of, the nous, or the mind, or whatever you want to call it. And, that for sense making and meaning making is a great place to start, to understand our reality and the fabric of that reality, to navigate the world.
Observe intellect, but we see that as something vital to understanding what it means to be human. That's what we find in the upper world. And when we come back down, we're bringing that with us. Going down in a cave doesn't mean that you just like immerse yourself in the state of mind you were in before.
Right.
You have that healthy state of mind and you're applying that to your life and living with use, with an intellect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Almost a kind of an enlightenment, but not an enlightenment as a finality. It's an ongoing aspect that you bring back in
Right.
through that. And
think of enlightenment as just a one-time experience. I mean,
right.
there is such an experience, but the idea is to understand the experience and live with that better understanding of what we are in essence and what this physical world is as a part of a bigger whole. Yeah.
Right, right. Very, very grounding, I think, to again navigate and steer a chaotic world in a world where there's a lot of psychic injury, and so that you can, because when I was 25 or 30, I had no salience, or my focus wasn't so good as far as recognizing why people behave the way they do, and so I've become much more tolerant of people because I do recognize through whatever means I've been able to help myself not be as ignorant, is to give people their space and latitude and understand why people behave in a certain way, and not to judge, and know that I have my crap, and my baggage and things like that. So it seems like Platonism helps with that kind of recognition.
It does. Although also I look around and I think the world needs more Plato. We need more the world.
I like to think that, and we were talking about this before we hit record, that Plato reminds me of Latin in a sense that, people say, oh, Latin's a dead language. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's in science everywhere. It's because I love botany and horticulture. And so I love the Latin-y stuff, the binomials and all that kind of stuff, and morphology and all, it's all using Latin. And so I think of Plato in that way because he shows up thousands of years later in a lot of our work. If you skip postmodernism and some of the more recent philosophical endeavors, which I extract nice things from the existentialists and the postmodern thinkers. I'm not putting them down. I'm just I think up into probably the early 20th century, a lot of especially the Weimar intellectuals, were anchored to that knowledge and that wisdom tradition and teaching, and so it informs so much of how we ask those metaphysical questions and the ontological questions. I think it really makes a huge impact on.
I think there's a tendency to think that whatever is modern is more advanced, is better.
Yeah.
But actually, if you go back to the thoughts of the ancient Greeks, it's really amazing. It's like if we could only bring that into our modern world, it would be such a more peaceful and rational world that we live in.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. It's just like, there was a sweet spot in the 13th century in North Africa and Europe and in the Middle East and things, obviously everybody still had their quibbles and there's, problems, but I mean, just some of the thinking that was coming out of it. And so I would say the same with that Hellenistic period, with what I call SPA, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Not so much Aristotle, but, at least Socrates and Plato, so much good. And even the pre-Socratics, again, I love Parmenides and Anaxagoras and Anaximander and all these kind of obscure people who were just kind of repeating, or not necessarily repeating, but they were bringing forward these really coherent ideas about how we can interpret what our sense organs are telling us and what this planet and our interactions with each other are doing. So yeah, hats off to the people of that period. They really had it together. And I think things get lost, and I think it's, talk about like iterative processes. I think it shows up in the nature of our psyche, of our being, is that we lose good ideas and then we bring them back into relevance, maybe by way of dragging things out of the past, and maybe by, the seeming new discovery. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think a sprinkle of Platonism of generous sprinkling of Platonism would help. Which is, again, one of the incentives I had in reaching out to you, is to just do what little bit I can to help keep, move things on and get the work out there. And you've done such a wonderful job. And again, your YouTube channel is a wonderful, valuable resource. Your book is amazing. I'm reading it right now. And I can't say enough good about it. So, and the fact that you did put the spiritual aspect back into it, I think is essential too. And you mentioned to me in our introducing ourselves to each other that you work with Peter Grimes. He's another good source, I believe. I think we should acknowledge him, that he and Jeffrey Mishlove have a number of conversations together. And so
Yes,
that's a yeah, and there's other videos and work out there that you can find. So Pierre Grimes or Peter Grimes would be a good place to go. And he was influential on you too. You worked with him, right?
Yeah, he's actually the teacher I've worked with for 20 years.
Wow, what a great teacher, huh? Oh my gosh. Okay, let me check where we are on time. Okay, we're just about an hour. So let me ask you, is there anything you want to bring forward? Anything you think that that as an introduction to your work that we should cover before we adjourn for part one? We can always come back for another session.
I just want to invite everybody watching to check out my YouTube channel. This is what I've been focusing on for the last 2 years now. And it introduces Platonism, and it's called All About Platonism because I want to cover more than just metaphysics. I want to cover it as a way of life, as a way of approaching life and understanding ourselves. And so you can learn about his dialogues. And for people who are just, I know some people are watching YouTube, they're just passively watching, and they click on a video and they watch it, and then they click on a video of like oh, look, a dog walking on 2 legs, or whatever. So some people are not going to get into it seriously, but for those who do want to read more deeply, who actually want to read the dialogues themselves, this is an introduction to them. It gives you kind of like a blueprint. You can see because some of them are really, really challenging to figure out what Plato's doing. As a spiritual teacher, he wasn't one to just tell you, like the university professors today. His idea is to force you to do a little work. But that's where the benefit comes. That's where the transformation comes. And so the idea of the videos on the dialogues is to give some pointers of what's going on so that when you read it yourself, you can get more out of it. And then there's these last few months looking at different metaphysical issues. It is also introducing the metaphysics, because I think there is a certain layer of information that you need to understand the metaphysical structure, so that when you're reading these dialogues, you can make sense. Like the first few years of my study was really just trying to figure out what's going on. And so I think if I can give some of that introductory level material, it makes it much easier to come into this tradition. And so that's what I'm doing on the website. Yeah. So I invite everybody to check it out.
Absolutely. And you're doing a great job too, because I think there's a lot of, philosophy can be very abstruse and very obtuse, as you pointed out in your book. And so I think having a secondary or a person to help with that process, sort of mentor you through it is essential. I did that with Whitehead. I did it with Sri Aurobindo. I mentioned those guys to you earlier. I wouldn't have been able to, I've got some of their books, and it's like, it really, and so getting someone to work through some of the steps with you and give you some outlines to work with, and then you can go back to the work and have more comprehension. And so what you're doing is I think good for that in that regard with Plato. And then people can go to other scholars and other people to get other perspectives. And so yes, sally forth and carry on. keep up the good work, because like I said, I think there's for wisdom to be apprehendable and more accessible, there's nothing wrong at all with going to someone who can, again, we have university systems with professors, and they're sort of giving a two-dimensional perspective on certain things, or it's a hastened perspective, unless you go again into super, like postgraduate kind of studies about certain things. So having people like yourselves, mentors, that can help with the understanding, I think is important. And so hats off to you for that. And so, yeah, we'll stop here because there are other things we could certainly go on and on and on. And I do want to go on. I want to talk about meditation and some of the where Platonism went once Plato had left this plane. And so, yeah, so if you're okay with that, we'll come back at some point and do some more conversing. And meanwhile, people watching the video can go watch your channel, and they can get more in the loop and aware of what the work is doing, or what the teaching is about. And we'll all come back together and meet again for a part 2 sometime, if you're willing and up for that.
Sounds like a plan.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Mindy, it was an absolute pleasure having you on for this conversation. And again, I think we're just we're teasing out some of the things that can be understood and used. I like to call them tools in the toolbox, these utilities that we can pull out for sense making, meaning making, and navigation of that which we experience. So thank you for your efforts, and thank you for your hard work. And I do recommend the book to everyone. And I will thank everyone in the YouTube audience. I always love to thank and acknowledge the people that I usually, you see your retention and your stats, and I get about 10%, and I'm like, oh, thank you guys so much. So anyway, much acknowledgement and love to the people who are still with us watching. So Mindy, thank you again, and I'll say goodbye to you after we stop the record. And also, again, thank you, YouTube audience, for being with us and hopefully gleaning some good information. Go to her channel. The link's below. All right. Bye-bye. I'll say goodbye to you after the record is done.